happy to welcome all of you to tonight's panel, which we hope will provide new and useful insights into the current political moment. For those of you who are new to our organization, Brooklyn for Peace has been around for more than 30 years, working against war, racism, cutbacks, environmental destruction, and a whole host of other evils. Over the years, we've stood with our sisters and brothers in such righteous struggles as labor solidarity, Black Lives Matter, and the BDS movement. Tonight, we're honored to have with us two people who were tracking right-wing populism before most of us had even heard of Donald Trump. In addition to our main speakers, we're fortunate to have Juliet Uccelli with us tonight as guest moderator. She's an activist, educator, and author. She's written about public school struggles, Eurocentrism in curricula, and Italian-American identity. She is a contributor to the book, The Cost of Privilege, Taking on the System of White Supremacy and Racism. She helped initiate Italian Americans for a Multicultural U.S., which has the outstanding acronym, I Am Us.
For my ex, I can't take it.
This organization joined First Peoples in opposing the celebrations of Christopher Columbus a few years ago. She was the founder and education director of the New York Marxist School / Brecht Forum, which in many ways lives on as the Brooklyn Commons. Without further ado, I give you Juliet Uccelli.
Bill Fletcher Jr. has been an activist since his teen years. On graduating from college, he became a welder in a shipyard and entered the labor movement. He's been active in numerous community and workplace struggles in several unions and was a senior staff person in the National AFL-CIO. He is also the former president of Trans-Africa Forum, scholar at the Institute for Policy Studies, editorial board member of the Black Commentator. He's the co-author with Fernando Gapacin of Solidarity Divided, about the crisis in the labor movement, and the indispensable ally, Black Workers in the Formation of the CIO, that he's the sole author of, and he's also the author of They're Bankrupting Us and 20 Other Myths About Unions.
So I've been obsessed with the right since I became radicalized. I was influenced by the Black Panther Party after reading the autobiography of Malcolm X. And I felt like the Panthers were the absolute legacy of Malcolm. And the Panthers talked a great deal about fascism and the fascist attacks and Nixon as a fascist, etc. And I wasn't quite comfortable with the analysis. I don't mean by that it made me nervous. It just, there was something that was missing. And as I became more of a Marxist, I started reading Georgy Dimitrov, who had been the head of the Communist International, and his historic speech to the 1935 Congress, 7th Congress of the Comintern, about fascism. And so for me, the right was sort of about fascism, and I couldn't quite figure out certain things about the state. And like many other people on the left in the US, I started to look at the issue of the right and fascism as synonymous, and that fascism basically was anything we didn't like. Any form of repression was fascism. The Chilean coup was fascist. The Brazilian coup was fascist. The Indonesian coup was fascist. Nixon's attacks on the Panthers were fascist. Anything that we didn't like was fascist. Any form of viciousness. And what I finally realized was that a lot of this is rooted in a complete misunderstanding of democratic capitalism that much of the left has. That we don't want to admit it, but we romanticize democratic capitalism. We actually think democratic capitalism is democratic. We actually think that democratic capitalism means that we're supposed to be following all of these laws and that things are supposed to be constitutional, and that there shouldn't be things like the concentration camps that were set up, not for the Japanese, but for the strikers in 1934 in South Carolina, North Carolina, and Tennessee, who were textile workers, they and their families were imprisoned in essentially detention camps, right? So that doesn't quite fit our analysis. That must be fascist, right? Or the repatriados, that is the expulsion of hundreds of thousands of Chicanos and Mexican Americans, right? Well, that can't happen. That must be fascist. And therefore, and there's this failure to understand the way racialized democratic capitalism works, that there's nothing particularly democratic about it, although it does follow certain rules and certain laws and must be distinguished from fascism. And I really want to emphasize this, that fascism, when we talk about fascism, and I'm not going to focus entirely on fascism, but I just feel that it's important to raise this. Fascism is not simply the instrument of the capitalists when they get pissed off, right? Which is in effect what many of us have actually believed. That it is when the capitalists get pissed off, when they are afraid of a rising movement, they call upon fascism. Think about the flyers that you've read in the different articles. They call upon fascism to emerge. And I think what we have to understand is that the political right, but specifically the fascists, are an independent social movement. And I would argue, in line with Chip's co-author, Matt Lyons, is that it actually, and Jay Sakai, is that actually it is a revolutionary movement. It is not a conservative movement. Metaphorically, fascism is about the burning of the underbrush within capitalism. It is about clearing out the deadwood in order for the construction of a different kind of capitalism, but a capitalism nevertheless. And in that sense, it's different from the counter-revolutionary revolts that you've seen, that we see at different times. It's different from Suharto's coup in Indonesia in '65. It serves a different purpose. It is not something that is simply manufactured by the ruling elite. The right-wing populism, of which fascism is a subset, I think that I would perhaps go further in some ways than Chip, but I have to say, before going there, that I owe an immense amount to Chip and Matt Lyons for their analysis in the book Right-Wing Populism in America. And if you have not gotten it, you have to get it. It's not one of these, you sit around and if you stumble across it sometime, it's good. No, you've got to get this book. To me, it actually, no, really. And I would say, and people that know me know that even if Chip is not sitting here, I'd say it, right? That it is a must read and in many ways reads like a novel. And I would strongly encourage it. The other book I would strongly encourage is Nicholas Florence, Fascism and Dictatorship. Right-wing populism is the herpes of capitalism. Right-wing populism exists within the body of capitalism. And it exists, as far as I can tell, in every capitalist society. But that it appears when the body weakens. But it manifests itself in different ways. That there are nationally specific forms of right-wing populism. And this is something that when I wrote the piece for Socialist Register, and I was doing some research for it, and I found it very interesting that right-wing populism is never the same. What you see in Rwanda is very different than what you might see in Algeria. What you see in Holland is different from what you'd see in France. That it's not the same thing. There's no cookie cutter. That each form of right-wing populism, although there's certain consistencies, each form has its own national specificity. And part of what we have to do in the United States is understand that the emergence of right-wing populism, it's not going to look like exactly what the Le Pen movement in France, or in the extreme form, Nazism in Germany. That it's going to look differently, and that you have to understand the histories, the religion, the culture of a country in order to understand the forms of right-wing populism. And for the United States, one of the points that Chip is making is central. that this is a settler racial state, that the form of right-wing populism here cannot be understood outside of that. That if you pretend that this is some abstract capitalist country, as opposed to a settler racial capitalist, your analysis and strategy will completely go down the tubes. That the notion that this country is very much founded on was this, which gives the right-wing populists an advantage over us on the left, is that the right-wing populists, their narrative is a version of the origin myth of the United States, which is paraphrasing what Chip was reading. Whereas we are encumbered by the truth, right-wing populists are not. And they take to an extreme something that's very fundamental in the United States, which is that we don't believe in history in the United States. We believe in myth. And what the right-wing populists do is that they take that and they develop a very comprehensive, easily understood myth of the development of society. And when the body weakens, this right-wing populism in various forms emerges. And in different eras you see things. And depending on the nature of the weakening, there's different kinds of manifestations of right-wing populism. So for example, one of the things that I've noticed when you look at history is that when there is a financial crisis, right-wing populism seems to take on a particularly anti-Semitic form, as opposed to when there's generic economic crises. When there's a financial crisis, and this is not just true in the United States, the right-wing populists go Jew hunting. They are looking to identify the Jew. And I'm using that term in quotes, right? They're looking to figure out which Jew is behind this particular financial crisis. And that's different than in other economic downturns. But we saw this, we saw this in the 1980s, not on the East Coast or on the West Coast, but where? In the Midwest, in the middle of a financial crisis that was particularly afflicting farmers. And what happens? The form of right-wing populism and neo-fascism that emerges is virulently anti-Semitic, right? So we have to understand the way that these different things emerge over time and the national specificity. So far, let me just sum up so far. So one is that democratic capitalism is not particularly democratic. It is very vicious. It is vicious even when it is going by the general rules and laws. The difference with fascism is that fascism is not constrained by the law. Fascism is completely barbaric and criminal. And an interesting example, how many of you saw the Kenneth Branagh film Conspiracy? Oh my God. No, okay, we gotta stop this. And somebody has got to go get that and we watched it for the rest of it. No, this is, I said that was a must read. This is a must see. This was 2001. It is a film about the Wannsee meeting. Right? When the Wannsee meeting, which took place in 1942 in Germany, to plan the final solution. And the chair of the meeting was Reinhard Heydrich, right? And the movie is called Conspiracy, and it's based on documents that were supposed to have been destroyed by, who was the aide to Heydrich, who the Israelis caught in Argentina. Eichmann was supposed to destroy this. But he was so anal, he kept this, and they were able to basically produce this film based on the transcripts of the Wannsee meeting. You've got to see this. Because one of the things that's fascinating in watching this is that they've come to a point where they basically decide we can no longer be constrained by the 1935 Nuremberg decrees. That those laws, which were envisioned by certain people as laws, those are constraining the operation of the fascist state, and that the time had come. And they basically say, how many people in the room are lawyers? And most of them raise their hands, and they say, we create the laws that we need, right? So there's a criminality and arbitrariness that you see in the operation of fascism. They don't even pretend at a certain point to be restricted by the law. Whereas within democratic capitalism, there's supposed to be laws, and those laws in part are aimed at trying to resolve contradictions within the capitalist class. Contradictions in a non-violent way, as opposed to contradictions between the capitalist class and the people. So we've got to understand this important distinction between democratic capitalism and fascism. So, and the second thing is the issue of national specificity. And the third thing is, and I don't know whether I'm running out of time.
You're just at 15 minutes, you have 25.
Okay, cool. So the third thing is that I would argue that the nationally specific form of right-wing populism in the United States is neo-Confederate. Now, when I say neo-Confederate, I don't mean the guys that wear these Confederate uniforms or people that basically believe Lee was correct and we've got to defend these statues and things like that. I mean something broader, and this is with all due respect to Chip, because in the book that he and Alliance put together, they talk about the neo-Confederates. But in looking at the politics, I'm talking about the politics, there's certain interesting themes that run throughout U.S. right-wing populism. For example, nullification. I don't know of any other country where right-wing populism has nullification as a central component. But nullification goes back pre-Civil War, right? The whole notion of states' rights and the ability to put restrictions on what the federal government does, right? This issue of nullification. And we've been seeing the reemergence of nullification. Every so often you'll see it pop up. It was going up in the, as the civil rights movement was increasing in strength, the state's writers, writers, nullify, right? Well, we're seeing it again, right? With what? Right. We're seeing it with Obamacare, and we're seeing it with gay rights, etc. Right? This whole issue of nullification. We see it also with an interesting thing, the deconstruction of political parties. I don't know how many of you know, in the Confederate States of America, political parties were banned. Yeah, interesting, right? That they were banned. And there was this mythical notion that by eliminating political parties, that there was a greater sense of accountability, right? But accountability between who? Between the political leaders and the people. Who are the people? Well, they're white people, right? And so you had this mythological notion that you could get away from bureaucracy, etc., by essentially banning political parties. Well, obviously the issue of white supremacy and the codification of a white republic. That right-wing populism, when it emerges at different points, very central to it is the notion that the United States is a white republic and the rest of us are guests, right? Wanted or unwanted, but nevertheless guests, right? And so this notion of the white republic. So when we hear Trump talking about taking back America, which is the term that used to drive me crazy when liberals would say it under Bush. But no, really, I hear these liberals that I never had America. Take it back, right? But when Trump is talking about that, they're not just meaning take it back from the Democrats. He is very consistent with this theme that runs throughout the history of right-wing populism, that this is a white republic and that it has been stolen, it has been ripped off. And the form of that, the personification of this, obviously, is Barack Obama. Now, there is a theocratic wing that to right-wing populism that Chip mentions that doesn't quite fit into the neo-Confederate characterization. And I'm not going to try to squeeze it in. I'm just going to say, as they say in the Matrix, this is like a variable that is a remainder, right? I can't work out the equation. But there is this theocratic element that is very, very important. And you guys talk about the dominionists. There's a whole wing of these right-wing theocrats that cruise personified in the political arena, but I'm not going to go into that right now. All right, so what can be done? Well, let me start with what should not be done. What should not be done is the notion that the worse things get, the better they will be for the left.
Oh, yeah.
That somehow that people like Trump, and listen, I hear it, I'm not going to mention names. I was reading something in a book that I happen to have in my lap by an author who lives in New York, but I'm not going to mention the person's name. And it was really interesting because what they were basically arguing is that many of us are too afraid that we fall prey to Democratic Party liberalism because some Democratic leaders will hold out the threat of the brown shirts. That is a threat of fascists. If you don't vote for us, the real dangerous right will get in. And I realized when I read this that he's right. I am damn sure afraid of the brown shirts. I'm not just afraid of the brown shirts, I'm afraid of the silver shirts, right? I'm afraid of people that have no shirts. I'm afraid of people that are wearing ties, right? And other kinds of shirts. That these movements are, this is not just an ideological question. As Chip was pointing out, we're dealing with people who are prepared to use not simply spontaneous violence, but we're dealing with people who are very well armed. And when I say very well armed, I do not mean shotguns and Winchester repeaters. I mean Kalashnikovs. I mean RPGs, right? I mean that 50 caliber machine guns. People that believe when Chip is talking about Armageddon, there's a segment of the right that believes that the Armageddon is a racial civil war Armageddon, and we must prepare. So the worse things get, the worse things will get. The slogan of the Communist Party in 1932, the Communist Party in Germany, was after Hitler, us. And only in a certain relative sense did that happen, right? In 1945 when Germany was divided, right? Only in that sense. But that's not what Thalman and the leadership of the KPD thought was going to happen in 1932. They thought that Hitler would expose himself as the fraud that he was and that the KPD could march in. So that's an assumption that unfortunately many people make now. And I hear it when people talk about, well, if Trump gets elected, it won't be that bad. For whom? Right, exactly. For whom? Right? So that's in the arena of what we shouldn't do. What we should do is two things. One is that we're seeing out there elements of what I would call mass left radicalism. And it's incredibly exciting. And this is not something that's just emerged with the Sanders campaign. There was a very interesting opinion poll several years ago, and I first heard about it through Bill O'Reilly, not known for being a Bolshevik. And it was interesting, right? Because Bill O'Reilly he was saying that this poll indicated that 7 out of 10 Americans believed in capitalism. But that's really interesting because that means 3 out of 10 don't. And if 3 out of 10 in a country of more than 300 million people don't believe in capitalism, that's a hell of a lot of people. And what we have been seeing over the last several years is that this 3 out of 10, and when you're dealing with people under 30, it's more significant proportion, who have very significant questions at a minimum about capitalism as a system. That does not mean that they have a coherent view. It means that there's something out there about the way that the current capitalism as we understand it is operating, actually existing capitalism is operating, that they are prepared to fight around. And we've seen manifestations of that through Occupy, through the Movement for Black Lives, through the Sanders campaign. This force must become more self-aware, must become coherent, must become organized. It cannot rely on great individuals, nor can we have the illusion that that any of this will result in just one organization. There are going to be a proliferation of organizations. We're going to have to bring these together. This will be essential in fighting the the right, because part of what we have to do is demonstrate that capitalism, we have to demonstrate to some of the base that's attracted to right-wing populism, that there really is an alternative, that their lives are in fact, yes, collapsing, and that there is a left alternative to this. The second thing is that we have to be proponents of a broad front to defeat the right. And for many people on the left, this is something that we start breaking out in hives. We start becoming that's going to turn us all into liberals, and then we start arguing about whether the popular front was a good thing or a bad thing. We have to recognize that we need, at any one moment, you need to have more friends than enemies. And that this is a very critical moment where the people in the middle cannot be allowed to remain in the middle and passive. That when they're in the middle, they are going to be subject to the various winds that are buffeting them, and there's a very heavy wind coming out of the right that can be very convincing, very awe-inspiring. And that if we are not able to influence that middle, then we are toast.